I might have shared that I'm a fan of the old TV series The West Wing. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Jed Bartlett is my president. Now, there's an episode in the 4th season of the show called 25. I won't go into the weeds, which is somebody's favorite phrase in here, of why the situation came up in the first place. But the basic setup of the episode is that the president's youngest daughter has been kidnapped by terrorists. And President Bartlett, a highly moral, deeply religious man, specifically a Catholic, doesn't feel that he's emotionally able to shoulder his responsibilities in an objective way because of his emotional attachment to his youngest child. Understandable. So Bartlett temporarily steps aside in accordance with the 25th Amendment to the Constitution and allows the next person in line, who happens to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives and from the other party, to exercise the power of the presidency. When the situation is resolved, President Bartlett resumes his office. This is the way people of integrity act. They don't automatically claim that the results of any election they lost were fixed or corrupt somehow, certainly not without evidence, lots of evidence to back it up. They certainly don't launch an attempted coup to keep themselves in power after they lose elections. And they certainly don't cook the books to make themselves immune from prosecution for any crimes they might have committed. If this country is founded on any biblical values, two among them are chief, even paramount, one from each testament. The first one of them is the ancient Hebrew principle that nobody is above the law, not even the king. And the other is from the New Testament. In God's plan, leaders are meant to be servants and not masters. Let's look first at that ancient Hebrew principle that no one is above the law. The book of Deuteronomy contains these explicit instructions about kings and the absolute limits of their authority. You shall set one from among your brethren as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not multiply horses for himself. And he shall not multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply for himself silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law in the presence of the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, so that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children, which is Deuteronomy 17, 15b to 16a, and 17 to 20. Do we have any evidence that any of this was ever actually carried out? Or was this passage meant to be prescriptive of the future rather than descriptive of the past? Since the earliest specific documentation of any form of Deuteronomy is found in traditions describing the 7th century BCE reign of King Josiah. As a matter of fact, we do. Joshua 24 describes a covenant renewal ceremony at Shechem after the conquest of Canaan is finished. Verse 26 of that chapter specifically says that Joshua wrote the words of the covenant enacted there in the book of the law of God. Similarly, Samuel wrote the rights and duties of the kingship in a book and laid it up before the Lord when Saul became the first king of Israel. After King Solomon died, his son Rehoboam went to Shechem to be confirmed as king over the 10 northern tribes. But they made his accession conditional upon his commitment to making their lives easier. A reasonable condition, right? When Rehoboam refused, the tribes seceded and formed their own kingdom, which is in 1 Kings 12. About 95 years after that, 7-year-old Joash was made king of Judah, the southern kingdom, in a palace coup. The high priest, who happened to be married to the little boy's aunt, had kept him safely hidden in the temple for 6 years. On coronation day, he gave Joash the testimony, which seems to be a reference to either an earlier version of the Torah or some version of those rights and duties of the kingship that we mentioned earlier. 200 years after that, a mysterious scroll, which was apparently some form of this very book of Deuteronomy, was found hidden away in the temple. King Josiah had the scroll read publicly. And the moment Josiah heard what it had to say, he didn't make excuses. Instead, he made a public commitment to follow it. 2 Kings 23:23. Given the number of times that the Hebrew Bible makes the same point, it's less important whether all of these instances reflect historical memory, and I think that at least some of them probably do. What matters is that the principle of nobody being above the law is firmly and deeply embedded in the Bible, a fact that some people in this country would do well to take note of. In this light, Jesus' call to servant leadership, which appears more than once and in all 4 Gospels, is less a surprise and more a continuation of his heritage. Passages like Matthew 20:26-28 make the point very clear. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's difficult to imagine anything more different from the dominion theology espoused by Christian nationalists and their leaders, isn't it? Now, moving on to more modern times, did anybody else in here remember that tomorrow, the 15th of June, is the 811th anniversary of the date when King John gave the royal assent to the Magna Carta? Anybody?
Sorry, I forgot.
Of course not.
See? Yeah, and that very fact is why it's being broken so often now. On that day in 1215, and I, believe it or not, I actually know where a few of my ancestors were that day. At Runnymede beside the Thames, the barons, who were tired of 16 years of John's malfeasance and all-around capriciousness, only agreed to end their civil war against him if John agreed to a charter of fundamental liberties which placed limits on his power. Now, don't get me wrong, this basically applied to the barons, but it was a start. Baby steps. You see, the English had absorbed this same odd notion that the king should be subject to the law, just like everybody else was. In formulating the Magna Carta, Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, self-consciously returned to those 2 biblical principles. No one is above the law, and that leaders are meant to be servants. We have another relevant anniversary coming up this week. It's on Wednesday. And a great many of us, the majority of us, were alive at the time for this one. Wednesday is the 54th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. This is relevant to the same point as tomorrow because the Magna Carta established legal boundaries for the English king, while Watergate established that those same legal limitations also apply to the American president. Now, I believe that exposing that particular scandal was a good thing, a very good thing. And frankly, I don't see any other way that it could have been done except through the media. Otherwise, not enough people would have found out about it, and the abuses would have continued unchecked and probably gotten worse. On the other hand, it was a very bad thing for this country in some ways that it was the media who outed the story. The practical effect of Watergate was that the media scented blood, and things have never been the same since. We all know the famous saying in the advertising business, sex sells. Well, scandal is flashy and scandal is sexy. And scandal sells. Watergate triggered a drift towards journalistic sensationalism foreseen more than 40 years ago when Don Henley released his hit song Dirty Laundry in 1982. He warned us that the evening news wasn't going to be about the truth anymore. It was going to be about a commercialized thirst for tragedy. We humans are a gossipy species. We don't want the news, we want the dirt. What is it Don Henley says? We can do the innuendo, we can dance and sing. When it's said and done, we haven't told you a thing. We all know that crap is king. Give us dirty laundry. Kick 'em when they're up, kick 'em when they're down. Sensationalism, quite literally, is a drug. And the media are addicted to it. And they've hooked so many of the rest of us on it during the past half century as well. That drift towards sensationalism didn't stop with the evening news. In the decades since Watergate, it's mutated into something much larger and much more dangerous. Just before the end of his term, President Eisenhower famously warned us about the growing unchecked power of the military-industrial complex. But in recent years, we have witnessed the rise of a third element. Many sociologists and media critics now speak of the military-industrial infotainment complex. Under a constant barrage of bread and circuses, our news, our politics, and our entertainment have been completely welded together into a multi-billion-dollar machine. It's been purposely designed to keep us perpetually distracted, enraged, and amused. And if you want a vivid visual picture of what this infotainment complex does to a community, just look at that old holiday classic, It's a Wonderful Life. Think about the dramatic contrast between Bedford Falls and Potterville. Bedford Falls represents the biblical idea of community. It's rooted in mutual care, sacrifice, and the leader as servant model. It's a place where George Bailey uses his building and loan to make sure that ordinary people can have a decent home of their own. Neighbors look out for neighbors in Bedford Falls. They bear each other's burdens, and they share what they have. But then George wishes that he'd never been born, and we see what happens to Bedford Falls. It loses its soul to predatory, unchecked greed. It becomes Potterville, a place dominated by cheap thrills, glaring neon lights, vice, cynicism, and relentless noise. There's no mutual care or neighborliness there. People are only looking out for themselves, forever in search of the next fleeting distraction in a futile attempt to numb their emptiness. And here's the punchline. An infotainment culture, such as we have now, is systematically designed to turn our Bedford Falls into Potterville. It profits from our division. It makes a fortune by training us to view each other as bitter enemies and rival consumers rather than as neighbors made in the image of God. It feeds us the dirty laundry of scandal and outrage. We stay addicted to the neon lights of the conflict, and we never notice that our actual communities are eroding right out from under our feet. You want to know the spiritual consequence of trading Bedford Falls for the cheap entertainment of Potterville? The anonymous prophet, now known as Deutero-Isaiah, diagnosed it almost 2,600 years ago. Hear what she said. This is a people robbed and plundered. They're all of them trapped in holes and hidden in prisons. They've become a prey with none to rescue, a spoil with none to say, restore, which is Isaiah 42:22. That's what happens when we allow the military-industrial infotainment complex to turn us from Bedford Falls into Potterville. We think that we're free because we have an endless stream of digital entertainment in the palms of our hands. But Deutero-Isaiah pulls back the curtain. We've actually become a people robbed of our empathy and plundered of our civic trust. We find ourselves trapped in holes and hidden in prisons. And how do we build those prisons? How do we find ourselves trapped in those holes? It happens when we allow the powerful to write themselves out of the rules that the rest of us have to live by. That's one of the things that we lost when they invented the doctrine that presidents have immunity. For almost 250 years, until very, very recently, American presidents didn't have immunity. Our constitutional architecture intentionally left no room for such imperial privilege. No matter the scale of the crisis, our system held that the office did not place any citizen, not even the president, above the law. And there are many of us who regard this modern shift as a pernicious legal doctrine that should be set aside as quickly as possible. Cooking the books to give leaders immunity from the consequences of any crimes they commit is the ultimate betrayal of Deuteronomy 17. It places the leader above the law, dismantling Bedford Falls and handing the keys directly to Old Man Potter. Now, Jesus gave us a tool designed specifically for unmovable mountains. In Matthew 17:20, he tells us that if we have faith as small as a mustard seed, we can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it'll get up and move. But mustard seed faith isn't about magical thinking or getting what you want. It's that tiny, relentless, invasive, and unstoppable potential of real integrity. I remember years ago I preached a message about God being that spot in the middle of your back that itches, that always itches, and you can't reach without help. And it won't go away until you do reach it. That's integrity. Now there's a real Quaker word for you. We plant that tiny seed of servant-hearted faithfulness because we are not acting alone. Look at Isaiah 30:18 like we did last week. Therefore the Lord waits to be gracious to you. Therefore he exalts himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him. As Judith has told us so many times, we don't have a gotcha God. God isn't waiting to crush us in our brokenness. The Lord is waiting to be gracious to us. God comes rushing in to meet our smallest acts of human justice with overwhelming divine mercy. Let that mustard seed of integrity take root for just a moment. Let it open our eyes to a time when we caught a clear but all too fleeting glimpse of what a society could actually achieve. In the summer of 1893, Catherine Lee Bates traveled west from Boston, eventually getting as far as the Rocky Mountains. And when she was there, she famously climbed Pikes Peak and wrote a poem about it. Or at least wrote the first version of a poem about it. On the way, when she reached Illinois, she went to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which celebrated the 400th anniversary of the European discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus. The massive grand buildings of the exposition were all painted a dazzling white, which is why history remembers it as the White City. Bates walked through a magical atmosphere full of promise and witnessed the marvels that were unveiled there, many of them for the very first time. She saw the towering Ferris wheel, the electric oven, and the telephone. Through the miracle of the telephone, which was just then beginning to catch on, she would have been able to hear live music that was being played miles away. She saw sparkling dresses made of spun glass. She tasted Hershey chocolate bars, and she marveled at the brand new invention of the zipper, of all things. Most of all, she looked up at the electric lighting blazing brilliantly all over the fairgrounds. It was a breathtaking vision of human potential. It was even more exciting by all accounts than the later 1904 World's Fair, also held in the United States, which was recaptured on film 40 years after that in the movie Meet Me in St. Louis. But there was a fundamental difference between the two. The 1904 fair looked backward with comforting, wistful nostalgia. The White City of 1893 looked forward with courage. That gleaming, forward-looking wonder is what inspired Catherine Lee Bates to link the White City to her famous poem, which became America the Beautiful. She looked past the corruption of her era. Remember, it's the one that is still called the Gilded Age. And she immortalized that ideal of justice and human promise in the line, "Thine alabaster cities gleam undimmed by human tears." President Biden used to talk about how we should build back better. I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. We have the chance right now to stop pretending to be exceptional. We have the chance to stop hiding behind the cheap distractions of Potterville or the defensive shields of invented historical memory and actually grow into something magnificent. You know, I want that. I want to be magnificent. I want us all to be magnificent. Do you? Are we ready to do this? Are we ready to meet God when God comes rushing in with overwhelming divine mercy at our slightest acts of human justice? I think and I hope that we are.